This work is titled Théâtre d'Opéra Spatial. Now, normally, the first prize winner of a local state art fair doesn't typically grab headlines in the New York Times or CNN. But the way in which this piece was created has not only dumbfounded art critics all around the world, it has sparked a much broader debate about what art is. Now, given the extraordinary times we're living in today, I'm sure some of you will have guessed, this piece was created by an AI application called Midjourney. The artist, so-called artist, provides the platform written prompts, and voila, out comes a pretty visually stunning piece of work. The colors, the balance, the level of detail, they all cater to our long-held sensibilities around visual aesthetics. So judging it on the final product alone, I think we can all see why the judges awarded it the top prize and didn't even bother to question the process. Now, whether this is art or not is a debate for another time. But I will remind you that in the not-so-distant past, even photography was questioned as a valid art form, and today it is celebrated and showcased globally as such. But I think if we can acknowledge that this ongoing infiltration of AI and the creation of such works almost satirizes the notion of human creativity, the one thing that we acknowledge that differentiates us from every other living organism on this planet, then can we also acknowledge that perhaps now more than ever before, we need to take the time to observe, to celebrate, to amplify the magic of the creative process far more than the result. And if you're willing to give me that space in the right hemisphere of your brain, let me introduce you to a community of artists where process, story, the translation of their resilient human experience defines their creative practice and their livelihood. See, their creative process is not influenced by whether or not someone likes their work, whether their work sells, whether you think it looks good, or if you somehow foolishly believe you could do a better job. None of this matters to them, and it is for this reason why this community, I believe, represents the very best of what the arts is and can be, the very best of what artists should be in their purest form. And they just happen to belong to a broader community, a community that I also believe represents the very best of humanity, a community that I'm proud to stand with as an ally and as an accomplice. Now, I'm embarrassed to say that I wasn't always an ally, let alone an accomplice. When I was in grade 2, that's 30 years ago now, I had a classmate with a developmental disability, and I teased him constantly. You know, looking back, I realized that that behavior was rooted in this tremendous cowardice, this fear of embracing someone different than I was, and the absolute shock at his resilience and endless optimism no matter what was thrown his way. And I would later come to realize that that resiliency was not because he didn't know any better. After learning about my behavior and a few smacks to the rear, it was my father who taught me that this difference was never to be mocked or feared, but it absolutely needed to be embraced. And at his birthday party, a few months later, I went up to him. I apologized profusely, and he said, "It's all okay." He gave me a big hug and said that we would be best friends. And that ended up being true for most of the years leading up to my move from BC to Alberta, and I still think about my friend Dimitri today. I consider myself tremendously fortunate because at that moment, I learned an extraordinary lesson about humankind, a lesson that few of us get to ever grasp, if at all, and that lesson being that people living with disabilities, the 1 in 5 Canadians who identify as living with a disability, they represent the absolute best about our species. It is their heart and resiliency. It is their unwavering optimism and their relentless pursuit to be better despite all of the human-induced barriers placed around them. As a professionally trained pianist, as an artist, and later as an arts administrator working for institutions like the BAM Centre, I was tremendously curious about how we could channel this resiliency and this extraordinary human spirit through the arts. So when I received a call from a headhunter about a leadership opportunity for a community arts and crafts shop for people living with developmental disabilities. It was like that moment we see in cartoons when a choir sings in perfect harmony, and you realize that the next chapter in your life is about to begin. Now, one of the final stages, like any other process, is to meet with the organization's board, and I'm telling you, I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't prepare that much for the interview. I looked at the organization's website. It didn't have that much information. I'd asked my friends and colleagues in the arts about whether they had heard of this organization, and nobody had heard about it. And I'd never been to the facility, so I really didn't know what I was getting into. And it was on May the 9th, 2017, a rainy day, I remember it very well, that I walked up to a building that was then home of the Indefinite Arts Society. It was, and it still is, a bizarre building. 3 tiny windows on a cinder block building painted in this dark copper orange. And as I walked up the stairs and walked through the automatic sliding doors, bang! It's a moment for me that's very hard to describe, other than to say that I was absolutely taken aback, physically so, by this energy field of creativity. 30 artists hunched over their desks, busily working away, very few lifting their head to realize that a stranger had walked into their space. And instinctively, at that moment, I knew what needed to be said, what needed to be done. I realized that this was just another step into my discovery more than 30 years ago, that this was not a community arts and crafts shop, as it had been described to me by the headhunter, but rather a community of some of the most extraordinarily talented artists that I had ever encountered in my life. Now, starting the job, I realized pretty quickly that developing and deepening your convictions doesn't necessarily make the task ahead of you any easier. In fact, in many ways, it's the exact opposite. Because I realized pretty quickly that when it comes to respecting and supporting individuals with developmental disabilities, turns out not very many people share that conviction, if at all. That life lesson that I learned 30 years ago, turns out it's not that widely taught. Let's add to this the fact that despite recent societal and political realizations that so many communities have been the victims of racial, colonial, discriminatory practices, the reality facing individuals with disabilities remains relatively ignored. And there are injustices. Injustices like the forced sterilization of the so-called mental defectives that happened up until the 1970s right here in Alberta. Those injustices, including the forced sterilizations, those are not part of our modern narrative around DEI, or as I call it, DEI-EIO. And we continue to underestimate, undermine, undervalue the extraordinary potential of our fellow citizens living with disabilities without realizing the ongoing injustice and without realizing, worse yet, the lost opportunity.
No.
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 Actually, our spaces are reserved for professional artists only.
As Canada's largest disability arts organization, our job is to never take no for an answer. We fight back, we push for equity, and we give Canadian artists with disabilities the opportunities they deserve. Learn more about the National accessArts Centre and how we're changing the arts for good.
I'm proud to be leading an organization that is using the power of the arts to make progress against this injustice and to demonstrate the opportunity and the limitless potential of artists living with disabilities. Yes, our experience, both as an organization and as a collective of artists, continues to be hampered by those around us who love to say no. But we stand strong as allies and as co-conspirators, as we work around, we fight, we step around, we find new paths despite those individuals and agencies because, as I continue to share with you today, their creative practices, their perspectives, and their stories matter. I would argue that this is a group of artists that is far more courageous and that their practice is far more unfettered and far more superior than that of a contemporary mainstream artist. Because artists with disabilities, they fight incredible hurdles to access opportunities to create new works. And because of their resiliency, they never back away from a challenge. They collaborate, they share new ideas, and they unabashedly embrace new approaches and new artistic disciplines with unbridled curiosity. And most importantly, they dare to create without knowing where their creations may take them. Take, for example, artists Mackenzie Wiggum and Mark Brickman. This is their piece called Sea Jam Blues, the first collaborative effort that they undertook, where they visually interpreted the color and the spirit of the namesake hit piece performed by the Oscar Peterson Trio. When so many art banks, art galleries, arts institutions scoffed at the notion of working with artists like Mark and Mackenzie, I'm proud to tell you that as a result of a groundbreaking partnership with Global Affairs Canada, this piece now adorns the entrance to the official embassy at the official residence, rather, of the Canadian Embassy in Tunisia. It is one of 13 works that are now part of the Government of Canada's permanent visual arts collection. Take another instance. Artists Rachel Harding, Jordan Tyson, Jonathan Stell, and Karin Hazel now channel their creativity to address some of the most critical matters facing our communities today, such as climate change. This work is part of a photo and video series called The Conference of the Birds, the Artist Collective's very first experimentation with those mediums, where this was recently presented at the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, once again with support from the Government of Canada. NaAC artist Laura Lapierre is Calgary's newest classical music composer. Without hesitation, she accepted an invitation to join our Open Lab initiative, where she joined 6 other neurodiverse artists, a notation specialist, and an award-winning string quartet to explore and build new ways to open up the music composition process to individuals with developmental disabilities. 7 miniatures for the Rolston String Quartet will soon be touring in East Asia later this summer and across the United States later this year. And I share these examples to bring up a few more points. First, artists with disabilities are keenly awaiting their next opportunity to create new works and to be showcased and recognized and acknowledged as bona fide artists. That despite the many no's that hinder our organization as we try to search for those new opportunities, it takes just one champion. In this case, it's a civil servant leading Canada's cultural diplomacy efforts to make a difference on the global stage. So when I asked him about why he continues to support the NaAC and our community of artists, he says, quote, "Working with the artists at the NaAC changes the paradigm of excellence in the arts. It shares and recognizes artists with practices outside the regular institutions. It presents their struggle and hard work and showcases their incredible work that express their belonging and contribution to our societies." It is thanks to partners like him, by the way, that the National accessArts Centre has become by far Calgary's most active, globally active arts organization. Perhaps most importantly, I'd like all of us to take a small step towards realizing that art cannot and should not be assessed, appreciated, or celebrated for their visual or oral aesthetics alone. That all of us in this room need to take the time to open up our eyes, our minds, our hearts, to delve deeper into the stories of the artists that are around us, and to learn, in this case, the perspectives and feel the raw emotions of a community that is still so often ignored, mocked, or trivialized, and feel something when we realize that it is this very community that is pushing the boundaries of what is possible in the arts and shining a global spotlight on our home. I've spent 30 years of my life intertwined in some way with the arts, first as an artist and now as an arts administrator, and I've realized that our sector is obsessed with this pursuit of perfection. Perfect choreography, instruments that have to be precisely in tune with one another, artwork that has to be hung on these perfectly painted white walls. But if AI will do anything, it will actually begin to change all that, because AI will find our flaws no matter how hard we try to hide them. And while this notion of perfection is something that we can appreciate in areas like medicine or engineering, there is an opportunity in the arts to embrace and celebrate difference, particularly when it comes to the intricate steps we as humans take to create new things and new ideas. And this begins by challenging our inoculation, almost since birth, around our avoidance of imperfections or flaws. It begins by challenging the system and challenging the hierarchy of the disabled versus the non-disabled, challenging the bizarre principles of what defines beauty, challenging the increasingly ineffective ways of defining and placing an importance on so-called intelligence, and challenging the world around us, the construction of a world around us, particularly in the arts, where we choose to celebrate this unstable notion of perfection rather than celebrating process and difference. I've shared with you today that there is a community of citizens around us who are the living representation of what it means to be resilient, creative, and steadfast. I've worked tirelessly in the past few years to connect this very community to the arts, and I challenge you all to do the same in your respective sectors. Thank you very much.